So today I would like to host our great speaker. Ashok came here already for the second time to this virtual lecture series. Everything started during COVID times about 2 years ago. So he advanced a lot over those 2 last years, and we had to invite him and to learn all these new developments over the last 2 years. So first of all, I would like to introduce Ashok. Dr. Ashok Ajoy is an assistant professor in the Department of Chemistry, joining the Berkeley faculty in 2020. Ashok got his PhD from MIT in 2016, where Professor Paola Capigliara was his advisor. Then Ashok was a postdoctoral fellow at University of California, Berkeley, from 2016 to 2020, with Professor Alex Pines as his advisor. In his earlier career, Ashok is already a recipient of numerous awards, starting with Canadian Institute for Advanced Research as Really Global Scholar. This is a program supporting a networking activity of outstanding early careers researchers. Ashok is also a recipient of a Google Faculty Research Scholar Award in 2020 and the Del Favera Thesis Prize from MIT in 2017. Ashok is well known for new development of instrumentation for NMR spectroscopy and dynamic nuclear polarization, and has developed novel techniques for low-field optical DNP, field cycling technology, and quantum sensor NMR based on optical spectroscopy. In 2022, Ashok was awarded the Caldarelli Prize in Magnetic Resonance in recognition of his work in these areas. So we are very happy to learn more from Ashok today on his research.
Okay, well, thank you for having me. And it's always great to come to the series. I like it because it's very informal, and there's also colleagues and friends from all over the world. And Olga always collects really good people in these seminar series. So thanks for the invitation. So I thought I'll say something about more recent work. So it's like since the pandemic hit, I also wanted to be very informal. So please ask any questions. I planned only for like a relatively short talk. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. So anyway, I was going to tell you a new work where we are using nuclear spins as quantum sensors. And I'll tell you a little bit about some interesting properties of these nuclear spins that are not immediately obvious on first sight. No? We just get a pointer. Okay. So yeah, so this talk will be focused on new opportunities with hyperpolarized nuclei. And I'll tell you what that means in a moment. But really, I think they all leverage the very long spin coherence of polarized solid-state nuclei. So, and diamond is actually a classic example because a lot of these properties turn up close to room temperature or at room temperature. But so I'll try to persuade you there are many more systems where these interesting properties turn up. So first of all, if you just take a solid and you were to look at it, and if the solid was to be composed of carbon, hydrogen, phosphorus, for instance, it would have a nuclei schematically represented as so. And these nuclear spins in solids have been well known in the NMR community because they have very long T1 and T2 times. For instance, the work I'll show you today, carbon and diamond, T1 is very easily 1 hour. So we operate at slightly elevated magnetic field. So all these properties become better at high field. But, very long T1s. And as I'll show you, coherence time, effective coherence time approaching 100 seconds at room temperature. So really quite outstanding properties. This is another material, pentacene, which is got similar properties than diamond, as I'll show you in a moment. And its pentacene is made of protons, hydrogen, and it's got a T1 at 77 Kelvin of 800 hours. I mean, that's a staggering number. So that's like 2 weeks or something. And that's the time to reach a 1/E level of the polarization or depolarization. So basically it means that if you can spin polarize it, you can keep it for some weeks and the polarization will survive. So really special, very interesting properties. So historically, actually, people don't like these properties because in NMR, T1 is the time to also polarize a sample. So if the T1 is 800 hours, you can basically get no signal because you have to wait for 4 weeks for the sample to magnetize. But as I'll show you, if there's alternate means to polarize a nuclei, then this long T1 can be very advantageous. And ultimately, it also upper bounds the coherence time that you can obtain. Right. The nuclei are also very abundant. So this is in comparison to electronic spins that we are very familiar with, like NV center and diamond, etc. The nuclear spins are very abundant and they are relatively strongly coupled. For instance, carbon and diamond has a natural abundance of 1%, and even with respect to the sort of the highest density diamond NV center samples that most people employ, that's easily a factor of 1,000 more abundant. So it's between a factor of 1,000 and maybe 1,000 to 1,000,000 more abundant. So there are many more spins. Many of these nuclei that I'll talk about today are spin half. And so they have no orientation dependence. That basically means that having a crystal or a powdered sample is for these nuclei equivalent. And you can orient the crystallite in any direction and it makes no difference. And so this is another special property that one can exploit, because if there's a way to polarize or initialize these nuclear spins, then you can exploit the fact that they can be hosted in any sort of material, in any orientation of material. Another special property is that if you have a large number of these nuclei and you have an ensemble readout, then that ensemble readout is non-destructive. And so it's possible to essentially watch these nuclei for a long time, so I'll show you in a moment. And they really have exquisite RF controllability, so they are effectively, if you like, qubits, but in the radio frequency, and it's possible to apply really millions of pulses to them with no problem. In the typical experiments we do, we're really applying like more than 5 million control pulses on these spins, and they tolerate it very well. So this is going to be the basis of what I'm going to tell you today about some interesting properties of these spins and what we can do with them. So as I was mentioning, the biggest weakness of these spins typically is the fact that thermal polarization is small, even in a large magnetic field. So for instance, if you take a 7 Tesla magnet, a pretty big magnet, carbon polarization is 1 in 10 to the power of 5. And this has been the most, so in a sense, all these wonderful properties were locked up because the polarization was very slow and one couldn't access it. So the way to overcome this problem is to try to optically polarize nuclei. So in diamond, for instance, we use an NV center electron and we shine light on it to polarize it and then transfer this polarization to the surrounding nuclei. This enhances the polarization significantly, so 1,000 to 3,000 fold or so at high magnetic field. And effectively, the acceleration of the acquisition is close to 10 orders of magnitude. And we can talk why it's 10 orders of magnitude, but it's significant, as I'll show you in a moment. But so for example, here is a typical NMR signal of carbon and diamond. So really like lousy signal to noise that you have to average for several hours. Actually, to get this graph was probably 8 hours of averaging. This blue line here. But a few tens of seconds of optical pumping can yield a signal of this nature. So very strong signal to noise enhancement. Great. So as I was mentioning, diamond is a really good material because many of these ideas are very easy to benchmark on diamond. It's a really classic material. It's got many amazing properties. But what I want to emphasize is this properties of nuclear spins in solids are broader than just diamond. And there's a wide variety of materials where similar properties can be obtained or can be anticipated to be obtained. So examples are semiconductors, of course, diamond, silicon carbide, HBN, etc., gallium arsenide, and even silicon itself. And the classic thing is like these NV centers in diamond. But also other interesting types of materials. So there's been a lot of interest now in these rare earth ion assemblies where they basically, for instance, metal organic frameworks or so constructed out of transition metal ions. So for instance, europium, cerium, lanthanum, and they have properties that they can be optically spin polarized, similar to the NV center. And one can imagine then the walls of this material hosting nuclear spins that can be polarized as well. Also, there are these materials which can be called triplet photoexcited or hosting triplet photoexcited electrons. So pentacene is an example. This is a pentacene crystal, and it's very big. So you can grow really macroscopic crystals about 100 times the size of a typical diamond crystal. And here the electrons are actually photo-generated. And so these materials have some pretty big advantage, which is if you turn off the light, the electrons go into almost a singlet where it has no magnetization, and so it does not relax the nuclear spins. As a result, the nuclear spin T1s are very long in these materials. And this is the reason why we can reach like 800 hours, 1,000-hour T1. This is really incredible, and this only comes in these sort of materials. So these are organic materials, these are inorganic materials, and these are semiconductors. And so there are wide classes of materials where these sort of similar properties turn up. So anyway, so I also wanted to quickly, just as a means of an introduction, give you some basis of how this polarization mechanism works. And I don't want to go into much detail, but essentially the experiment we perform is very straightforward. We apply laser light. This is the diagram of a lattice. You can think of the electron as the NV center, the nuclear spins as carbon. And what we do is we shine light on the electron to spin polarize it, as so here. And then there's a transfer step. So the electron polarization goes to the nuclei. This is done with a microwave sweep. And for some technical reasons, it's most convenient to do this at low magnetic field. So we often operate at 1 to 30 millitesla. That's very broad. You can do in any lowish magnetic field. And then the detection we usually do at high magnetic field for convenience of detection, as I'll mention in a moment. So of course, by definition, these electrons are defects. So there are very few of them in the lattice, maybe 1 part per million, 10 part per million, etc. So there are many more nuclear spins. And just from an angular momentum conservation picture, you really have to polarize all the nuclei. You need to push polarization into this nuclear bath very fast because there are many more nuclei than electrons. And so to do this, essentially, one can think of to do this efficiently, you need to polarize electron rapidly and push the polarization out to the nuclear spins rapidly. And far away nuclear spins are polarized by a process called spin diffusion. This carries the polarization to larger and larger distances. So typically in the samples we use, both powder crystal samples, the inter-electron distance is maybe around 20 nanometers. And so, you have about 10,000 nuclei per electron, and each of these nuclei has to be polarized to some extent. And we reach an average polarization of about 5% on all of them. So that's a pretty macroscopic polarization level. Right, so I will skip this slide. It's more for the experts, but it shows how this polarization scheme works with some Landau-Zener diagram. Perhaps I'll skip for the moment. What I did want to say, though, is, by smart engineering, you can enhance the rate of this polarization development. And this has some utility, especially if you want to polarize large masses of samples, or you want to polarize the samples very rapidly. So you want to generate polarization very rapidly. And so to do this, we built this apparatus. Let me just walk through it. What the apparatus does is it can polarize quite large masses of diamond samples, more than 20 milligram or so. And it can polarize very rapidly, as I'll show in a moment. But what it has is basically about 30 lasers shining on the sample simultaneously. So here is a 3D printed structure. And each of these fibers is a 1 watt laser, kind of just pressure fit into this structure, and the diamond is placed at the center. So you might say, oh, wow, that's a lot of optical power. So, so it depends on what you're trying to do. But if your goal is just to generate the largest polarization fastest, diamond is a good material because it can sustain these powers and nothing happens to it, basically. So we can cram in quite a lot of optical power. So we use between 24 to 30 watts of optical power. And this is what the apparatus looks like. So it's a compact device. Each of these things here is a laser. So laser, 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 etc. So there's a wall of lasers. And yeah, the total power is about 24 to 30 watts. And a sample is carried on this test tube out here. And then this is the test tube that goes into a magnet that allows us to then measure afterwards. So, when we first started building this apparatus, we didn't know what's the limit of the powers that we can put on the sample. And let's just step back and ask, why do we need so much power? Because suppose you want to rapidly polarize a sample, you need the electrons to be polarized very fast. And the rate of electron polarization in a bulk solid is determined by the laser power. So more laser power you put, you can polarize the electrons, the NV electrons, very fast. And then you can transfer this polarization very fast with high microwave power. So a combination of laser and microwave power can transfer polarization very fast. And then in a given time, so in 1 second of time, for instance, you can polarize more spins more efficiently or more rapidly. So, but the catch is really, how do you sustain this 24 to 30 watts of optical power on the sample? And we found actually a very simple scheme to be able to do this. So what we have is a test tube with a diamond here, and we fill the test tube with water, a little bit of water, not too much. And essentially we blow cold air at it. And so here we exploit the property. The diamond is a very good thermal conductor. So any heat you put on the diamond immediately gets transmitted to the surrounding liquid, in this case, water. And then you can just cool the water with air. So there's no flowing water in this case. The water is fixed, but there's air is blown on this tube of water from the sides, and water having a very large thermal capacity, you can basically make some sort of convection cooling apparatus that cools it very efficiently. So here's the experiment showing this actually. So this is time on this axis. So that's 2 minutes. And we've applied 24 watts of laser power. So that's a lot of laser power usually. And we're measuring the temperature very close to the diamond. And you see that the temperature is not even reaching 30 degrees Celsius. So even after the sustained amount of heat or laser power that's been applied. And then when you turn off the lasers, it kind of goes back to something like 15 degrees. So with this, actually, this apparatus is very scalable. So we anticipate in the future even going to something like 80 lasers or something. And each laser, because the other advantage of this polarization schemes are the laser is only used to shine light on the diamond. It's not used for any kind of fluorescence detection. As a result, the laser intensity noise is not so critical. And you can use low-cost diode lasers that can be arrayed together. You don't need one big fat laser. And so this is very easy to construct at scale, basically, and deploy. Just to...
Hi, Ashok.
Yes.
Yeah, this is Soham. I had a question. So about this heating up, doesn't that change the resonant frequency of the microwave, and how do you monitor that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, the temperature coefficient of diamond is like 70 kilohertz per Kelvin or so. And so in this 10 degrees increase is a fairly small change. It's only like less than 1 megahertz. And the resonance line, even if you have a single crystal, is about 20 megahertz or so. So it's a marginal change. It doesn't matter.
Thank you.
Yes, but please ask more questions. But anyway, but the conclusion of this engineering effort is that we can inject a lot of polarization very fast into the diamond. And this leads, as I'll show you in all the subsequent slides, to really high signal to noise. So what this graph is showing is rate of polarization injection in some units, let's say percent per second, as a function of laser power. So, if you use only one laser to if you use 20 lasers, you get a factor of some 200-fold improvement or something in injection. So, and the logic, the physical logic is very straightforward. You just polarize the electrons very fast, and then you can push the polarization out very fast. And diamond is a very good material because its other allied properties like thermal conductivity, the strength of the lattice, melting point, all are very good, so it can sustain these powers. Right. Okay, so let me now move on to really showing you some interesting properties of these nuclear spins. So for the longest time, most people doing polarization, hyperpolarization would polarize the spins and measure what's called a free induction decay. So that's a pi half pulse and you acquire, and this is one shot signal. So all the data I'm going to show you subsequently is one shot data, no averaging, because the signal is so good, as you'll see in a moment. But typically the spins, the lifetime here, you can call this T2 star, that's under 2 milliseconds. And that happens because, as I told you, the nuclear spins are fairly dense in the lattice, and they are interacting with each other by dipole-dipole interactions. And mathematical form is less important, just that you can think of them as really strongly coupled. This interaction is causing this decay. Anyway, so in important early work that we did here, we realized that it's possible to extend this effective coherence time by using some pulse sequences. I'll describe in a moment. But I guess to our own surprise, we were able to extend it by quite a lot. So this is the free induction decay here, and this scale here is milliseconds. So that's 10 milliseconds. And if you do something, as I'll describe in a moment, you can go to a scale where that's hundreds of seconds. That's 573 seconds, so that's about 10 minutes on this scale here. And if you just compare a 1/e crossing, that's 91 seconds. This is at room temperature. So even from the point of view of just polarized solids, etc., it's very interesting that it can be so long. And the experiment is very simple. All it is I have a train of pulses. So it's similar to what people do with dynamic decoupling, if you like, except the train of pulses is not pi. It's like some other angle. Any angle is okay, but not pi. And what we're doing also in this experiment, is we are measuring the spins in between the pulses. And here we exploit the fact that the readout of the spins is non-destructive. So one of these windows looks like this actually. And so you can see in one shot, you get a really beautiful oscillation. This is the Larmor precession of the spins, okay, precessing. And because of the very high signal to noise, you can see this really beautiful Larmor precession. And what we do is we take this Larmor precession after each of these windows here and make it into one point, where if you like, we're looking at the amplitude of this oscillation. And that becomes 1 point here. And so in this experiment, we're applying about 6 million pulses. And so there are 6 million points on this graph. So there's 1 point after every pulse. So I think this sort of illustrates some really interesting features of these nuclear spins. First, you can put a lot of pulses on them with no problem. There are millions of pulses, and all the pulses have slight error, etc., but it's actually very robust against it. Second, you can read out the pulse spins sort of, in a non-destructive manner, just because we couple to a cavity, and the cavity coupling is very weak, and so the cavity produces no back action on the spins. And so then because this and the just natural coherence of the system, you can observe these spins for a very long time in one shot. So that's kind of what we're going to use for all the experiments I'm going to show you in a moment. So the same data actually can be replotted as in a different way. So here is plotted in a semi-log graph. So signal, log signal versus time. And you'll note that it's not an exponential decay, because if it was an exponential decay, it would be a linear line on this graph. Once again, I would emphasize there are actually 6 million points on this graph. So we really have, with this very high signal to noise, and the fact that we've sampled it so many times here, we have a really accurate way of saying that it's not mono-exponential. Actually, on the other hand, if you plot it in a slightly different way, which is you plot log signal versus square root time, you find that it lines up exactly on a linear line. So that's 6 million points, and maybe 5.5 million points are in a straight line. So it basically shows that the decay is very close to a stretched exponential with the exponent of half. So it's actually slower than mono-exponential. So when we look at this crossing and say that T2 is about 90 seconds, that's just using a 1/e crossing, and that's like a poor metric. Actually, the thing is, the curve gets slower as you go longer. So longer means it gets slower and slower. So actually, that's the reason why we can go to 10 minutes here. And in more recent work, we can extend this even further.
Ashok, one question. So, is there an intuitive way of why this kind of pulse sequence works to preserve the coherence? Like for dynamical decoupling, you can think about filter functions and think about that. But why exactly is this working here?
Yeah, so in dynamic decoupling, what you're trying to do is mostly remove like Z noise, right?
Yeah.
The phasing of the spin. So here, the dominant reason of the decay here is basically interactions between the spins. That's the dominant source of decay. And what this sequence does is also written here. It produces like an average Hamiltonian, which commutes with the initial state. You can just think of the state that you've produced on the x-axis is a conserved quantity, and it will remain long-lived. And that's the reason why you can keep it.
I see.
Yes, please ask if you have a question.
Yeah, Ashok, I had a question. This is Ambarish. Will this also work with electron spins? I don't.
Yeah, so there's nothing special about it being electron nuclear spin. I guess it's just the regime of operation. Most people doing NV centers work in the limit where NV centers are very dilute, you know. So I guess all of these experiments are in the opposite regime. The spins are dense. The interaction between the spins are playing an important role in causing decays and stuff like that. And in that case, this will work for sure. Okay, I guess I'm running late now. So let me, so I wanted to tell you maybe just 2 stories. I'm going to skip this one, but I'm going to tell you about some interesting games now we can play with these nuclear spins. And then I'll show you how we can make NMR sensors out of them. And I was also going to maybe briefly explain some quantum registers and quantum information like things we can do, but perhaps I'll skip for want of time. So the experiment that I just showed you is actually can be just thought of as spin locking. So it's the same experiment I just showed you, and have a bunch of pulses, and you can think of what the spins of what's happened to the spins is there's a conservation axis which I'll call X. So the spins are locked along X, and this is the reason why they have very long lifetime, long X. Now, if you consider an experiment where instead of along with this pulse sequence, you also apply a field in the Z direction, like an oscillating magnetic field. And you can already see that you can use it as a sensor for the same reason. You can ask what will happen to the spins. The spins that were formerly locked along X now will undergo a precession along this YZ plane here. So it'll be precessing like this. And if you just were to think about it, the natural feeling is you're going to break this conservation law that you set up with a lot of difficulty in the first place. And so you would expect that the moment you come out of this XY plane, you would die very fast. And this oscillation that you set up here will be very short-lived and destroyed. So I'm going to show you that actually this is not the case. And you can really use this coherence extension expands to more than one dimension. So it's just not along X. And so it's very interesting. And this is what we'll use to actually ultimately make a sensor. So let me first show you data, and because of the signal to noise, you can see the signal is very strong here. So what we're measuring in this experiment is we've applied this pulse sequence, millions of pulses, and we've applied a small AC field in the Z direction. We're measuring amplitude and phase. This graph is 5 seconds into the motion already, and this is a 5 millisecond window. So you can see it's already, it's presumably long-lived because you can already see it 5 seconds in, and this is 15 seconds in. And what I've done is I've collected every 4th point and just drawn a line through it. It's got this 4-point periodic motion because the angle here is 90 degrees. Okay, and that's the reason why it's 4-point periodic. Anyway, you can see that this oscillation sustained themselves for a very long time, and this is all like one-shot signals, very high signal to noise. You can see the spins actually going up and down in amplitude and phase, even after we have applied like close to 200,000 pulses. Now, the interesting thing you can do is, because you have amplitude and phase, you have information of the spins in the XY plane. And it's possible to also extract the information of the spins in the Z axis, because you know that ultimately there's very little decay of the spins. So, if this, with amplitude and phase, you have complete information of spins in the XY plane. And if you assume that the spins don't decay much, you can extract their Z component as well. So basically, you can do tomography of the spin vector in 3 dimensions in real time. This is a very special feature of the system. You can actually tell to a very good high precision where the spins are in an XYZ plane, and XYZ in a block sphere, if you like. And that's what we've done here. So this is experimental data. It's not animation, it's animation, but it's real data here. And so 5 seconds in, you can see that the motion of the spins is basically that they're tracing the vertices of a square or square-like. And these are the 2 projections, so X, Y, and YZ. And in the scheme, basically, you only get mod Z and you don't get Z. So you only can get information about half a block sphere. But it's still very special because we are able to track the dynamics of the spin in 3 dimensions. So the spins now start behaving as if they are compass needles, like magnetic compass needle, and just a very highly magnetized object that you can track in real time. And this is what it is 15 seconds in. And once again, you can see it looks like square-like. So now there are very interesting games you can play with these. I'm going to show you briefly a few of them. But for convenience, it's most convenient to just look at the YZ projection of the spins. This is like the off-plane precession. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to look at the YZ projection of these spins. And that's what's plotted on this graph here. So this is YZ projection, and on the vertical dimension is time. And we are not doing any data processing or anything. It's just raw data, basically. And you can see that the spins are tracing vertices of a square continuously. And if you put them, we are not joining any lines. It's just the points here, and they form this really nice prismatic shape. And what does this mean? It means that the spins are going in the square-like trajectory in a very stabilized manner for many seconds. So this continues again for it can continue for 100 seconds or so, in a very stable manner. So that's surprising because not only can we lock the spins along one axis and maintain their lifetime, it's also possible to, make all these interesting shapes or make them in interesting trajectories and also stabilize these trajectories. Oh, sorry. And here are some other examples. So just by changing the angle, you can make the spins go as a pentagon or hexagon or whatever. Not. And again, time is on the vertical axis, and this is like 1 second of the motion. So I guess the important thing to note is that is very surprising. Because these are strongly interacting spins, and you'd expect them to all die very fast. But you can stabilize their motion and maintain the stability for a very long time. And there's even a theoretical puzzle. I'll show you the answer to why it works in a moment. So perhaps the experiment that shows why it works is best is this experiment. So here what we've done is we've locked the spins along one axis, and then we apply this AC field at some time here. So when they are locked along one axis, if you look at the YZ projection, that's just a line, or rather that's just a point. And time is plotted in this direction here, so this becomes a line. And then you turn on this AC field, and for a moment, the spins don't know what to do. And so they jiggle around here, and then afterwards they self-stabilize automatically. And this time here is very short, just like a millisecond or so. And after a millisecond, they automatically stabilize into this very, very stable orbit. And then they, when you turn them off, they once again collapse into a line. So some very surprising, and for the experts in the audience, the origin of the stabilization is very interesting. It comes because what we're doing is the coupling between the spins actually is helping in the stabilization, and we populate what's called a dipolar ordered state. It's a state where the density matrix, or the state, becomes analogous to the Hamiltonian. And the Hamiltonian is a many-body dipolar Hamiltonian, and this leads to stabilization. So actually, it basically turns out that if you don't have the coupling between the spins, this will not work. And so, well, the coupling between the spins is usually considered a nuisance. You don't want spins to be at high density because, oh, we don't, this coupling between the spins causes coherence to decay very fast, etc. This is to our advantage here, and this is what leads to stabilization. So now let me show you what we can do with this. So we can make a very good sensor with these, just using the fact that this motion is very stable. And just as a background, oh yes.
Sorry, Ashok, can I interrupt for just 1 second? Yeah, so that the interaction is, I mean, it's still a repulsive interaction, isn't it? So is it, I mean, why is it forming this type of a locked state? Is it similar to some form of a Wigner crystallization type of a phenomena where repulsive interactions can make things ordered?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if I've not thought about a picture like that, but in a simple-minded way of explaining why it happens is basically because again, as a result of this pulsing, now you have both pulses and applied field, you produce this new Hamiltonian. This Hamiltonian has the dipole term. It's just a complicated, many-body interaction, and it has a single spin term. This is what you can measure. This is what is also present in this average Hamiltonian. But importantly, the state thermalizes to this Hamiltonian. So you're actually using this eigenstate thermalization hypothesis. The state becomes the Hamiltonian. So it's like thermalized to this Hamiltonian. And because the state thermalized to the Hamiltonian, it cannot decay. It's like a closed system. And is a kind of completely unitary, and the state has become Hamiltonian, nowhere for it to decay. And then you're just measuring this. And that's the reason. So yeah, I think this has not been well appreciated, I think, even in the spin resonance community much, because maybe with electronic spins, it's harder to do this stuff because the pulses have to be really close, and measurements, these non-destructive measurements are not so easy, etc. But I think these nuclear spins, you can apply a lot of pulses and you can see this emerge. Well, I think the same principle should be applicable even for dense NV ensembles, for instance.
Right. And is this, in this model, as well as in the real world, is it sensitive to differences in the interaction terms? So, for example, the distance between the spins, for example, if there is a variation, does this locking go away?
No, it's very stable, because essentially whatever it is, all of that information has gone into these terms, and you've just made a state that's exactly the Hamiltonian. So nothing happens to it. That's why it's robust, actually. That's the reason why you get this higher level of robustness. So it's very robust. All the microscopics don't matter anymore. It's a kind of very interesting.
Right.
Yeah, so let me let me show you how you can make a sensor with that, and with that I'll end. Our motivation has been, like many others in the field, to try to do nanoscale magnetic resonance. nanoscale or microscale magnetic resonance. And this was a big effort a few years ago with many groups involved. And the classic way in which this experiment is accomplished is use an NV center that's very close to the surface, and you've got a molecule, for instance, and the molecule hosts nuclear spins, and the nuclear spins are doing something similar, which is they are precessing and producing a Z AC field, and that AC field is picked up by this sensor. And there's been many works in this field, and maybe I'll just point out one of them from the Harvard group, where they were using not one NV center, but a small ensemble of them in a maybe 10, 20 micron region, and they were able to discriminate molecules. So this is optically detected magnetic resonance, and they were able to show these chemical shift resolution. So this is an important landmark, because it's only after you can measure chemical shifts that these techniques become useful from a chemistry point of view, because otherwise you're just measuring all protons or all fluorine or something, and that's not very useful. So really obtaining a chemical shift resolution, which is frequency resolution, along with spatial resolution, that's it. So you need to have this twin advantage, so to be able to make it useful. But you'll note that while they have good resolution on their sensor, the lines are still fairly broad, and they're not well spaced. They're quite close together. And that is because all these experiments are operated at low magnetic field. And for people working with NV centers, this is obvious why. It's very difficult to control electrons at high magnetic fields. So our goals are to do the same kind of experiment, nano and micro scale NMR, but we want to do it at high magnetic field. And you go, why do we do it at high magnetic field? That's because what you're measuring is chemical shifts, and chemical shifts are changes in nuclear Larmor frequency based on shielding by proximal electrons, and basically the chemical shifts scale with magnetic field. So let me show you a very simple NMR example. So this is amino acid valine at 1.4 Tesla. That's the sort of spectrum you get. And by the way, the spectrum I just showed you was not even at 1.4 Tesla, right? That was at 0.08 Tesla, 80 millitesla. And that already shows the challenge in doing stuff with NV centers. The moment you go to slightly elevated fields, it becomes very difficult to operate. Already at 1.4 Tesla, the resonance frequency of the electron will be approaching like 40 gigahertz or so. So anyway, this is at 1.4 Tesla, but if you were to go to 18 or 10 Tesla, that's the kind of spectral resolution you get. And this is the reason why in NMR community, everyone gets bigger and bigger magnets. There's a sensitivity reason, but the more important reason is this sort of chemical specificity or discrimination power. And that really requires you to go to elevated magnetic fields, literally, because even though if your sensor is very high resolution, the target, the peaks are all close together, and in this case, the peaks move apart. And that's the reason why this x-axis is always shown in part per million. It's not in absolute units. If you were to plot in absolute units, you'll find that the peaks have moved apart further in this 10 Tesla case, 9.4 Tesla. Right. So. And so the conclusion is chemical resolution increases with magnetic field. What happens is also sensitivity increases magnetic field, because what you're doing with NMR is you're basically measuring the time varying magnetic field of nuclei that are set precessing. But when you go to elevated field, the nuclei themselves are more polarized. And so you also get a boost in sensitivity. So for instance, the Harvard experiment, which I'm a really big fan of, is a very good experiment, but that's at 80 millitesla. And if you compare 80 millitesla to 8 Tesla, that's 100 times improvement in magnetic field. And so 100 times more sensitivity, and also 100 times more resolution. So you can win a doubly in both dimensions, resolution and field and sensitivity. So our goal was to see whether we can make an analogous quantum sensor at high magnetic field. And so that you can sort of detect the spin precession, I feel. And the logic is pretty much the same. We're going to use the carbon spins as a sensor, and that's all. And so here's a test experiment. So I'm just going to go quickly here because I'm almost out of time. But so the idea is that if you've got an oscillating magnetic field, you similarly will get these orbits that I just showed you. Except in this orbit case, we made the field from the outside. In this case, it's an unknown field. And if you've got an unknown field, you'll get this stabilized orbit. But once again, this is the raw data, and this remains stable for many seconds. And importantly, if you do a Fourier transform, you can extract all the frequencies that you put on the system. So you just can make a very good spectrum, a spin spectrum analyzer. Or a quantum sensor, and you just keep measuring, and you can do a Fourier transform. So it's basically the long T2 that you have in your system allows you to get very high spectral resolution. So if you zoom into one of these, you have a spectral resolution that's better than 100 millihertz or so, just without any tricks. So with this, our goals are to make a quantum sensor that goes at high field. And the advantage of high field is not so much for the sensor, but for the analyte. So the analyte spin that you're trying to detect is more polarized, and the chemical shift is more. So 2 wins there. And the advantage of using these carbon spins is all the experiments I'm showing you now are at 7 Tesla, but it's very easy to go to 20 Tesla, 24 Tesla, because it's exactly the same, and the pulse sequences will not change at all. Yeah, so you can do other things. For instance, you can, if you have a time varying field of some nature, you can track it and so forth. So let me just skip this, but here the students made a time varying field, and you can track this time varying field, etc. But I think this slide is important. This shows a sensitivity comparison for different sensors that we put together. So it has 2 axes here, a field, a bias field. That's the field at which you operate, and sensitivity on this axis. It doesn't talk about spatial resolution, which is another dimension, which is not on this chart. But you can see that squids occupy more or less this low field regime. NV centers are more or less in this low field regime near Earth field and slightly higher than Earth field. The highest reported experiment was Jörg Wachtrup, this paper in Science. That was at 3 Tesla, but this was a very significant experimental effort to operate at 3 Tesla. It's a difficult experiment. So we are right now here, so that's at 7 Tesla. And this was a very early experiment, so we believe we can easily push the sensitivity by another 50x or so with some fairly straightforward improvements. In which case, we'll already start approaching what the NV centers can do at a length scale of about 10 micron or so, but at much elevated field. And so if you want to measure an analyte spin, the analyte spin is more polarized and got higher resolution, etc., by the same factor. Okay, and so here's the idea of what we're trying to do. So I should say we've not done it yet, and this is what's happening in the lab right now. But so just the idea is to make what's called a relayed NMR sensor. So typically in NMR, you have an analyte, and the analyte spins induce a current in a coil. That's what you measure as NMR. The problem is these coils cannot be made very small. Smallest microcoils are about 100 micron, and so there are very interesting things that happen in the 1 micron scale. So for instance, you can do NMR at a 1 micron length scale. You can study NMR in cells, the big frontier direction, tracking chemical reactions inside single cells, etc. Very interesting, very important direction. Also, many things like surfaces, or I'll show you in a moment. So this is all outside the ambit of current NMR technology. So on the other hand, if you use a polarized spin ensemble and it's optically polarized, you can shine light only 1 micron region. And even if you've got a big coil, you can produce NMR, a signal from only that 1 micron region of light that you put. So if you've got a 1 micron nanodiamond, for instance, you can still pick it up with a big coil. And why can you pick it up? Because the spins are polarized so much that they have such a high signal that they will still produce a measurable signal, this coil. And so now if you've got an analyte spins in proximity to this 1 micron nanodiamond, you can use these polarized spins as some sort of amplifier to relay the information of the NMR of this analyte into the coil. And ultimately, this allows us to gain, why the amplification comes is we gain in what's filling factor. So we can go close in close proximity to the analyte. And effectively get a boosted signal because the spins themselves are polarized. And what our goals are is to make something like a 1 micron NMR detector just made of diamond dust. So all you need to do is literally just scatter diamond particles on something or target diamond particles into something. And then you shine light on it and it would report on NMR in a 1 micron environment around it. And if possible, this could have a lot of impact in many applications. Okay, so let me skip this. And it's a big advantage, therefore, is just to conclude, is you can possibly get micron scale NMR. It's deployable in situ. It's possibly get high chemical resolution. And because they are orientation independent, the particles, you can do everything that I showed you on a crystal equivalent in a particle. Now, in fact, the carbon spin lifetimes themselves may be lower in a particle because the particles are not well, have like other defects or whatnot. That's a material problem. But just from the point of view of this orientation is not an issue, is very much true in particles. And so some of the exemplary systems we've been studying or we're trying to study with this are microenvironments. So these are droplets. So for instance, water and oil droplets, and we can load nanodiamonds into them at various concentrations and sizes. So these are larger particles. These are, by the way, Olga's particles, and these are smaller nanodiamonds. And this is a fluorescence image overlaid with an optical bright field image. This is fluorescence here and bright field here, and this has other applications too, but some of the interesting applications are that we can put nanodiamonds in these droplets and then measure NMR inside droplets. So inside this microenvironment, and then make basically an optical NMR sensor and make each droplet little microbeaker so you can monitor reactions inside droplets, etc. So it would be very interesting. So let me skip. I was going to show you some things about quantum registers, but I think I'm out of time. So I will go to the last slide here and come back to the conclusion. So the thing to note is, in the experiments I was showing you, the NV center is just used as a polarization source. That's all. So we just shine light on the NV center. The light can be really bad quality, whatever, and the NV centers themselves can be relatively low in coherence. It doesn't matter because it's just used as a polarization source. And then afterwards, you're just using the nuclear spins, and you're using the fact that these defects have relatively low concentration, so they don't affect too many nuclear spins. The nuclear spins coherence properties can still be maintained. And so if that philosophy can be extended to other systems too, as I mentioned, semiconductors, rare earth assemblies, or these photoexcited electron systems. And the idea is that just use the electrons as polarization, and then you can exploit, you can rapidly polarize the nuclear spins, and then you can start using their long T1, long T2, etc. for interesting properties like spin sensing. So yeah, obviously this is the work of my students. So the people in blue were the people who did most of the work here. And let me also acknowledge the funding agencies who gave us money for this. So thanks, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Ashok, thank you very much for this illuminating presentation. It's very impressive, extremely interesting. So we are open for the questions. Stephen, please.
So yeah, I had two questions. Firstly, I get the idea that you've got your diamond crystal, that you shine light on it, that the NVs get polarized and they convert that polarization to the nuclei. But I don't get then how you use that as an NMR probe. So there has to be, do you need to then send the polarization back through the NV? How do you read out? Where's the readout from these hyperpolarized nuclei?
Yeah, so in the way I described it, we are not going to do optical readout. That's possibly an approach that one could pursue too. But what we're going to do is just NMR readout. So let me just go back to this slide here. So what we do is we polarize the nuclei. The carbon spins are the sensor, and you will read out the carbon spins, and they will relay information about nuclei next to them. So for example, let me just sorry to skip over here, but in this experiment, what's been done is the carbon spins, similar to this experiment I described, the spins have been locked in direction. A weak AC field has been applied. So this AC field, for instance, mimics precession from surrounding nuclei, and this field is of the order of maybe 10 picotesla or so. And what happens is the spins, carbon, the sensor spins that were locked in one direction now undergo this extra precession that shows up as a oscillation, and doing a Fourier transform allows you to extract information. It's like AC magnetometry. So the same schemes that people do with AC magnetometry, NVs, can be done with nuclei, and you're detecting through induction.
Okay, so after you've spin polarized your sample, you then transfer your sample to a traditional NMR system.
Yeah, it's an NMR magnet, but we're not doing traditional NMR detection. Yeah, right. So it's in a sense, it's similar to traditional NMR. Yeah, it's true. So what we do is we polarize optically, and then we go into a high field magnet, right. And then all this detection is done in a high field magnet. So which
is done by induction, not by. So you're relying on the fact that you've got lots and lots of carbon atoms. It's a bulk measurement, is my point.
Yeah, we can go down to, so for instance, even on suppose you have just one micron particle, you can still get pretty good SNR because of the very high SNR that you have. So it's a bulk in the sense that, yeah, it's not one spin, but we're targeting this regime where it's between 1 and 10 microns. So that's the target. We want to do NMR at 1 micron resolution.
Okay. So my other question was about the use of this clinically. So what's the prospect then of being able to put these nanodiamonds into the body, or so that we can actually do an NMR measurement far quicker than we can at the moment?
Yeah, so it depends on what one is trying to target. So I think the place where this sort of thing will shine is using the fact that ultimately a sensor can be housed in these nanoparticles. It can be targeted somewhere. And I don't know in the human body, but certainly any application where the nanodiamonds can be taken to in very close proximity to the kind of place you want to detect, for instance, inside a cell or the membrane of the cell. So you can get proximal information from only the part that's proximal to the sensor. That's where I think its big utility will come. As far as MRI, I mean, I think there are some interesting applications for imaging the particles and things inside in an MRI scanner. But one would have to make a scheme where the particles are never injected fully because of FDA regulations. So I mean, that's a different conversation. But if you allow yourself to expand the material class from diamond to other molecules where similar properties can be hosted, then I think there's a wider class, and maybe there are a lot of MRI applications for those molecules.
Abdelani, please ask your question.
Ashok, very nice presentation. That's great talk. So my question is related to the laser power, because for your early experiments, you use these 60 or 40 watts, I don't know, to 30 watts, or 24 watts. And then in that case, you have bulk diamond in water. So if you translate this to use carbon as to sense this AC or these things from analytes, I see many challenges, like because laser power high destroys these analytes. Any ideas how to get rid of this issue, or I mean?
Yeah, so this is a good point. So why we use such high laser power here is because in these experiments, we just want to test the concept. And so we're using a large mass. So to just get large signal. And, you know, a diamond has other issues related to if you've got a really large mass and you don't distribute it. And with particles, you can distribute a wide area and maybe have but otherwise you just pack a large mass, you got a lot of penetration loss. And so basically the high power is needed now because we have like some 10 milligram of mass of diamond. But if you go to one micron particle, you need like some less than a microwatt of power to polarize.
And then how it scales with NMR, because I mean, for optical detection with NVs, I understand. I mean, but when it comes to NMR sensitivity for such 1 micrometer nano diamonds with such laser power, low laser power?
Yeah, so the you just think that you need some amount of power to go in and polarize the electrons, and that is very similar to in the NV case when you're doing detection, because the goals are the same. You want to polarize the electron faster than its T1. Basically, right? So your T1 is a millisecond. You need enough photons to come in to polarize the electron faster than a millisecond. Now, if you have a really large sample with a lot of electrons, then you need to put a lot of power to be able to polarize them rapidly enough. But the catch is, I think, where this would shine is if you've got few particles or small number of particles, you don't need much optical power, and then this is very safe and no problem. It's in these, you can think of the alternate limit where you're trying to make like a gyroscope. I didn't show you this, but gyroscope, a magnetometer or something, bulk diamond, large number, then you need large mass. And here the powder is advantageous too, because you can basically make infinite mass with powder that you cannot do with single crystal. Right? So you can just pack a hole and then blast it, and you can get very, very high signal. Because you just have so much mass of diamond. So yeah, so the power is determined by mass.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
Ashok, I also have a question in continuation probably of previous questions. So did you make some estimates for level of detection of some typical analyte like pyruvate? Would it be, say, in the range of millimolar concentrations? If you have some kind of estimations, would be very
actually I do. So maybe, sorry, I feel bad to skip over here, but yeah, this is a very busy slide, but let me just show you an example of why this high field is also beneficial for the same reason. So glycerol, let's just take glycerol as an example. And if you take 10 micron cubed but neat glycerol, so 10 molar or so, this in a 10 micron cube volume, you've got about 11 nanotesla of total magnetic field that's going to be produced by these spins. That's at 10 Tesla. This is the advantage of high field, because if you were to do the same experiment at 80 millitesla, you're going to get about 800 times lower or something, 100 times lower. Anyway, so our current polarization, our current sensitivity, this was some months back, now it's much better, but it's something like 70 picotesla, but in like millimeter cube, not in micron cube. So, we have some already we are a little bit better, maybe a factor of 10 or so, but we have some straightforward ways to improve it. And we are optimistic that we should be able to relatively easily reach this sort of limit. Now, the question is whether you can measure nanomolar or picomolar analytes. This may be more difficult, but let's just say if you want to do, millimolar range in a 10 micron volume region, then I think this might be feasible. So for instance, some of the application we have in mind is taking a single cell and trying to image its cell membrane or something, stuff like that, by just putting particles next to it. I think this could be feasible. And then the improvements in sensitivity this is all done at room temperature. If you go to low temperature, you get a big boost in the signal. That's because the T2 improves another factor of 10 or 100, and the signal to noise improves. And by forcing ourselves to work at room temperature, we are slightly lower in sensitivity. So, and the materials themselves can be improved, etc. So, I'm optimistic that we can be able to achieve this 10 micron resolution at 10 Tesla.
And also, I don't know if you did any estimates on, say, how much nanodiamonds are needed inside the cell. So that, say, milligram per milliliter also would be very interesting characteristic.
Yeah, so this estimate is obtained. The 70 pico is with a 1 ppm diamond concentration, but fully in that region. So one can back calculate how many NVs you need in that region. Yeah, so these experiments are ongoing. We're trying to do some simple-minded experiments and to try to measure NMR. But it's also intellectually interesting, because what you're doing is relayed NMR, using one spin to detect the NMR of another spin. And very similar to this quantum sensing world, where the NV is the sensor, the analyte is what you're trying to detect. Here, the carbon is the sensor. That's all the difference.
Yeah.
I mean, that's good question related to this, because we are not in quantum sensing regime, or because when you use NV, I mean, or in other words, you cannot, let's say, use optimized quantum sensing when you use carbon spins.
Well, I think there's maybe I didn't understand your question properly. So, I guess when you're in the ensemble limit, there is no meaning for quantum sensing in any case. So even people who take NV centers and call them quantum sensors, the moment you've gone more than one NV center, I don't think you would call it quantum sensing anymore. But if you use that buzzword, then this would also be in the same umbrella. But yeah, here we are using spins in a 1 micron, 10 micron region. And so you have an ensemble, small ensemble.
Okay. Yeah, that's thanks.
Thank you very much. Do we have more questions? Yeah, it seems everybody is highly satisfied with Ashok's explanations. So Ashok, thank you again very, very much for your excellent lecture today. Today it was very instructive, and good luck with your great research.
Okay, thank you. Oh, nice to see you, Alex.
Well, Alex,
yeah, thank you, Ashok. Enjoy your presentation.